This is an RNZ podcast.
You could hear the house just gasp, what on earth? And what was fascinating, people thought I had inside info, someone was leaking stuff to me. If you look back over the recent history of New Zealand's parliament, it would be one of the issues that perhaps dominated question time for almost 18 months.
Welcome to Crimes NZ with me, Jesse Mulligan. In this episode, we're looking into a case of political corruption. In 2009, Taito Phillip Field was convicted of bribery and corruption and sentenced to 6 years in prison. This after he helped 8 people secure visas in return for work they did on his private properties. Before going to court, Field's actions were examined in Parliament, most intently by opposition spokesperson on immigration, the Right Honourable Lockwood Smith, who asked the minister a whopping 400 questions on this topic.
It was a major, issue at the time. It blew up just prior to the 2005 election. And of course, initially the Prime Minister, Helen Clark, didn't want to know about it, just 5 days before the election. But she finally, about 3 days after the election, agreed to an inquiry into the issues. But she constrained the inquiry quite significantly. The terms of reference related to just conflicts of interest in his role as a minister. But of course, he wasn't Minister of Immigration. So the chances of there being a real conflict of interest under those terms were almost nil. Now, Noel Ingram was appointed to conduct the inquiry, and he was meant to report in 9 days. So the inquiry was set, 20th of September 2005. He was meant to report back on the 4th of October, 9 working days later. It was 9 months later, 9 months before he finally reported. And of course, initially I kept questioning the Prime Minister about what was going on because, the report just didn't appear. And so it was 9 months later.
400 questions, you obviously had the bit between your teeth. Was it one of the bigger issues that you took up as an opposition MP? I
think if you look back over the recent history of New Zealand's parliament, it would be one of the issues that perhaps dominated question time for almost 18 months. Yeah. And it was quite tricky because under the standing orders, you cannot question a minister about something the minister is not responsible for. So sometimes when I'd question the Prime Minister, for example, she'd say she's not responsible for the actions of a Member of Parliament. And what Taito Phillip Field did, he did these things as a Member of Parliament, seeking to get special directions for, I think he made 481 applications to the Associate Minister of Immigration to get special directions to enable work visas or work permits to be issued to certain people. And 262 of those were issued. And that's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so the questions were all about, I had to make them a minister accountable for what I was asking. And that was quite tricky because otherwise they'd be ruled out.
You, of course, were Speaker of the House yourself, so you know all about this, and we'll come to maybe the impact that this had on the approach that you took. Was Field in Parliament during this inquiry? Was he still an MP?
He had to stand down as a minister because while he was not a Minister of Immigration, he was a minister outside of Cabinet. And they stood him down not long after the inquiry, just after the inquiry was announced. But, he was in Parliament all the time. And at times, even though I was just trying to make sure the executive was held to account properly. I wasn't trying to knife Taito Phillip Field, but understandably, I guess, he took it pretty personally. And over a couple of weeks thereafter, I've been questioning for about 8 or 9 months. He took a couple of points of order and challenged me to repeat what I was saying outside the House. Right. He said one day, I think if I had any spine or any guts, I would repeat these allegations outside Parliament. And then not long after that...
Sorry, the significance of that for people listening who don't understand what that would mean is that you are protected somewhat when you're inside the House.
Yeah, when you're inside the House, you have privilege. And the Speaker seeks, every time there's a new Parliament, the Speaker seeks from the Governor-General those privileges, the privileges of Parliament. And normally they're sought, say in the UK, they're sought from the monarch. Here in New Zealand, they're sought from the Governor-General, and the Governor-General grants those privileges to members of Parliament. And they're really important because it means a member of Parliament can say anything inside the House without being sued. But if you repeat outside of the House what you've said inside the House, you can be sued. And I guess Taito Phillip Field was threatening me to...
Yeah. And to return to what you were saying earlier, it's not as simple as you being able to get up and say, hey, Field, you've got these allegations, answer yourself. There's a whole procedure and protocol, and you have to put a question to the Minister. And so you chose... you were doing it between Helen Clark, the Prime Minister, and also the Minister of Immigration.
And also the Minister of Immigration, yeah. For example, I guess there was one day in particular that I'll never forget. It was the question time on the 11th of October 2006. And I was questioning the Minister of Immigration at the time, and I had to ask whether the Minister was entitled to know certain things before decisions were made, because I had to frame a question so that, the Minister had some responsibility, because the Minister was not responsible for something Taito Phillip Field did as a Member of Parliament. Yeah. So that particular day, I asked a question, because the House would, when the Speaker called me, after some months of this, weeks of this going on, the House would just go quiet. And on this particular day, I asked the Minister of Immigration whether the Minister was entitled to have been told by Taito Phillip Field whether a certain person who was known as the Ty Tiler, I'd better not mention his name, it's not fair, the Ty Tiler had tiled 460 square metres of floor in Mr. Field's home in Samoa, and had also, for no pay, and had also tiled Maxine's cake shop, owned by Field's stepson in Samoa, and laid a new floor at Maria's Healthcare Pharmacy, run by Mrs. Field's daughter-in-law in Samoa. And you could hear the House just gasp, what on earth? And what was fascinating, people thought I had inside info, someone was leaking stuff to me. I just read the Ingram report carefully. Right. It was fascinating. When the Ingram report was released 9 months after the inquiry was announced, it was July 2006. Initially in Parliament, Taito Phillip Field held it up and claimed it exonerated him. We managed to get a snap debate the next day. And members of Parliament were waving it around in Parliament saying how it showed that Mr. Field had the utmost integrity, and even the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Cullen, actually held the report up and said it showed what a wonderful Member of Parliament Taito Phillip Field was, and he'd helped so many. If he was guilty of anything, it was being so helpful to his constituents, and accused the opposition of being useless because we didn't help our constituents as much. Right. And so that was the environment. And the day after that, on 19th of July that year, the Prime Minister, Helen Clark, said there was no evidence that any further inquiry was needed. And yet a few months later, the police initiated an inquiry, and I just kept those questions rolling, and to me it was an important function for Parliament, because if you look at the judge's statements when he sentenced Taito Phillip Field, he said that Field's actions had, I get his words exactly right, had threatened the institution at the foundation of our democracy. Now, those are pretty hard words.
So the police announced they were investigating all allegations against Mr. Field 6 weeks after the Ingram report was released. I guess that could have been the end of it for you, but I think you continued pursuing it, right? Yeah, because what troubled me was the risk. If Noel Ingram hadn't been able to, get at exactly what had gone on, I was troubled that, would the police inquiry really get into what had happened. So I just kept the questioning going to make sure that the issue didn't get buried. And I'm sure politically it was useful too, right? If there's someone on the run in the government and the Labor Party and the top brass are denying it, you've got to smell blood.
Yeah, I think the thing that made it politically more powerful was exactly what you said, the way the leaders, the way Prime Minister herself and the Deputy Prime Minister had claimed there was no issue here, that the report had exonerated Taito Phillip Field, etc. And I think that's what made it a big issue, that To me, if you read Ingram's report, it was so clear he didn't have the power to actually require anyone to provide evidence. He didn't have when Helen Clark set up that inquiry, she didn't give him the power to require anyone to answer questions. So Ingram had to actually try and construct what he thought might have happened. Interestingly, the Associate Minister of Immigration who made the decisions around those people is still in Parliament. It was the Honourable Damien O'Connor was Associate Minister of Immigration at the time. And he claims, even though there was a lot of evidence, he'd been told what was going on, he claims he didn't know. Interestingly, after the election in 2005, he was moved from being Associate Minister of Immigration. So he couldn't be questioned.
Well, not wanting to get us in trouble outside of the privilege of parliaments in Lockwood, but I guess it takes one thing for an MP to request special treatment for a certain person, but then someone within the Ministry of Immigration has got to agree to it, right?
Yeah, and that's why the role of the minister was quite important. That's why Noel Ingram tried to construct what the Associate Minister, because the Associate Minister makes these decisions, tried to construct what he knew, but it never was revealed what the minister actually knew.
Yeah. Were you, and I'll point out to people who don't realise, but you're a member of the National Party, and Helen Clark was the leader of a Labour government, so we'll bear that in mind. But were you disappointed with how the Prime Minister at the time dealt with it, or did she deal with it just as you would expect someone to do, given the political damage that could occur if she'd done it another way?
I think I was a little surprised because when I read the report in detail, it was so obvious there were issues there. And Helen Clark was a very competent politician and a very competent Prime Minister. And I was a bit surprised that had she personally read that report in detail, I would have been surprised had she made the decisions she did straight afterwards. And I'm surprised even her advisers didn't say, hang on, Prime Minister, there are some issues here that need to be thought about.
You talked about the terms of reference, by the way, and it takes me back to my public law classes at law school, but that's quite a common way of dealing with the problem, right? You announce an inquiry, you hand it over to a QC or whoever to do the inquiry, and then you tell them what they're allowed to investigate, and you make it so narrow that actually the most damaging stuff might not even, in fact, is prevented from coming up. And not saying that's what happened here, but it's in general political terms. Yeah,
and there's nothing wrong with doing that. To me, the surprising bit was, given the report that resulted from the inquiry, I'd have thought if Helen Clark had read it carefully, should have seen that there are issues here, even, and that might have suggested, not treating it quite as, suggesting no further inquiry was needed. And I guess it was the way it was treated when it came out that caused me to keep questioning it, because it was so obvious to me. There are issues here that Noel Ingram is almost begging someone to follow up on. He didn't have the power to get the answers. And when you read the report carefully, you just see what he was getting at. And I mean, I didn't have further inside info. I just read the report. and how did
it all come up in the first place, by the way?
Forgive me, I can't remember how it blew up. I think it was mainstream media got a story.
Right.
What the story they got, I think, was warnings from immigration officers offshore. They even actually named the immigration officers that had tried to alert the minister, the associate minister at the time, that there are issues here. And when you read the Wikipedia background of the associate minister at the time, the fact he was associate minister is strangely missing from his Wikipedia record.
Well, you'll have to become a Wikipedia editor, Sir Lockwood, so you can correct the record.
Never.
You're too busy on the farm.
Too busy doing other stuff.
So back to the Taito Phillip Field timeline. We've had the inquiry. We've had a lot of questions from you. The police get involved. They investigate. And then it goes to trial. Yeah. You're involved in the trial?
No.
Okay.
And I think it would not be appropriate either. I think it was... all I did, I think, was kept the issue alive and prevented it from being buried, and I think demonstrated that there were issues that needed to be investigated.
So he was on trial for bribery and corruption, and offhand, do you know what the rules are around bribery and corruption as a minister or a member of the House?
I think they're standard legal rules. You know, there were allegations made that that Taito Phillip Field had indicated to people wanting his help to get special directions on work permits that they're required to pay him, and that sort of thing, and which is standard bribery and corruption type.
Presumably you'd need to declare it as well, like a bit of a conflict if you're an MP and you were giving work to people who were also applying for visas from your government.
Obviously it wasn't declared, or it would have been obvious what was going on.
Yeah.
But he was also convicted of, I think, at least a dozen charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice as well. And so it was not just charges of bribery and corruption, it was also charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice. And I think those were possibly, what caused the verdict to be the sentencing to be quite severe. I mean,
right, he'd done wrong, but then was presumably trying to cover it up.
Yeah.
So what happens? Oh, he's found guilty. He's sentenced after 4 months of trial, and then is he still an MP at that stage when he's convicted?
No, I think by that time he had been. Forgive me, I can't remember the dates that on which.
Presumably, not a good look to have one of your ministers or ex-ministers, one of your MPs in court each day answering these allegations.
He'd been removed from the Labour Party, and he resigned, I think. I can't remember now, but he resigned from the Labour Party
in 2007.
And stayed in Parliament as an independent MP for a while. And so, once it became clear what was going on, Labour moved to... he was stood down immediately. In fairness, the Prime Minister stood him down immediately from his ministerial roles. But then when
the inquiry.
But then once it was, I think once the police, once it went to prosecution, he was removed from the Labour Party.
Mm. And so did the Prime Minister, as you recall, at any point say, hey, we might have got that wrong?
Not that I recollect, no. It was... It was something that, as a Member of Parliament, I didn't particularly enjoy. Because I wasn't trying, as I said, I wasn't trying to knife Taito Phillip Field. To me, it was an issue of ministerial accountability, and I didn't see ministers accepting, or the Prime Minister for that matter, accepting the need to address more clearly and more definitely a serious issue. And as the court found, it was a hell of a serious issue.
We haven't mentioned David Cunliffe, who was the Minister of Immigration when you were putting these questions to him. How did he respond? He's an interesting sort of parliamentary character.
Yeah, he at times tried to appeal to the Speaker that my questions were out of order or, and interestingly, the Speaker Margaret Wilson was quite strong in requiring the Minister to answer my questions. But I put a lot of work into crafting those questions because I knew that, if you asked a sloppy question, it could be ruled out. You had to be very careful to make sure the question addressed ministerial accountability.
Leave no wiggle room.
Yeah. And Speaker Wilson was very fair in making sure that that ministers couldn't try and use points of order to wiggle out of answering. Mind you, not all questions were answered, but in not answering them, at times the seriousness of the issue is revealed, if you like.
I should say, by the way, in case she's listening, that Margaret Wilson was my lecturer for those public law lectures all the way back in the early 90s, well before all this, University of Waikato. So this was the first time, I believe, in New Zealand that a Member of Parliament has been found guilty of bribery and corruption. Is it significant beyond the case itself in terms of precedent or its impacts on New Zealand political life?
I think it was a very important message that none of us are above the law, that it doesn't matter who you are in New Zealand, if you break the law, you can be held to account. And I think that was an important message to members of Parliament that sometimes might think that they can do anything. Well, they can't. But for me personally, I guess it reinforced what I believed question time could do. And so when I became Speaker of the House, I tried to make question time more valuable to people, more valuable to members of Parliament, where they could, if they asked a minister a straightforward question, they could get an answer to it. And that had not been happening for some years. For some years, all ministers had to do in answering a question was just address it, if you like, use some words that might relate to the question and get away without answering it. But while I was Speaker, I actually would sit a minister down, explain the question to them, and require them to answer it. And I think that was members of the public found that actually quite useful.
You were technically a member of that government, or maybe not technically, you remember the party anyway. Some of them might have expected you to show leniency towards government ministers, but you felt that your role required some impartiality and required you to be as hard on them.
The role of Speaker is absolutely that, Jesse, that a good Speaker, if anything, in my humble opinion, ought to be slightly harder on their own party ministers, if you like. Okay, I was a National Party member, but I was Speaker. And one of the primary roles of Parliament in our Westminster system is holding the executive to account. That's the cabinet, if you like, the Prime Minister and the ministers, holding them to account. And question time is so important in doing that. Members of Parliament must be able to get answers to fair questions. If a member gets up and makes a political statement and asking a question, well, don't expect the Speaker to protect them if the minister gives a political answer. And the minister gets the last say. So to me, but where a member asks a straight question seeking information, where the minister's accountable, the minister should answer it. I mean, there was the occasion where I even sat the Prime Minister down, a good mate of mine, John Key. I sat him down and said, Prime Minister, the question asks this. This is a matter, there is a considerable public interest. The House deserves an answer. And call him to his feet to answer it.
Did you run into Taito Phillip Field after all this?
No.
Hear anything from him?
No.
Sad story?
Sad story, because Taito Phillip Field had a very good reputation when in Parliament. He was a person who tried to help his people. I mean, he was a leader among the Pacific Island community. Taito is a title. And in his heart, I believe he really did try to help people. But, this tragic issue of, wanting to get some benefits from the good work you do, you can't do that as a Member of Parliament. I guess in all my 29 years as a Member of Parliament, I spent so much time helping constituents, but I never, ever wanted anything returned for it, not even their vote. I often say as a Member of Parliament, as a national Member of Parliament, you're helping people who are the less privileged in society, helping them deal with the bureaucracy. And, I spent half my life helping people who probably never voted for me, and I never ever asked them for their vote. Never. Never asked them for anything. Your job is to help people when you're a Member of Parliament. And I'm sure Taito Phillip Field set out to do that, but sadly crossed that line of not fully appreciating the boundaries that are necessary. And I think it was very sad because I think by the time he was convicted, I was Speaker. And, I was kind of sad that a former member, a former colleague, ended up that way.
You've been listening to Crimes NZ, hosted by me, Jesse Mulligan. This week, I was joined by former Speaker of the House, the Right Honourable Lockwood Smith. Thanks for your time, Lockwood. An amazing team goes into producing the Crimes NZ podcast. Melita Tull, Charlie Drever, Sam Hollis and Ayana Piper-Helian. This episode was edited by Grant Walker and Liz Garton. Tim Watkin is executive producer of RNZ Podcasts. Crimes NZ is available on all good podcasting apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio and Google. It's even on YouTube now, if that's how you'd prefer to listen. Remember to follow the series so you don't miss any new episodes. And look out for other great podcasts from RNZ, like The Art of Entertaining, a complete change of pace to this one. In it, hosts Jamie Poi Poi and Maria Tanner plan a party using a rulebook from the 1970s.